to mention several people and institutions who deserve a big thanks for making this lecture possible. This year's supporters include the School of Communication and the Faculty of Communication, Art and Technology at SFU. We also owe thanks to Krista Shelnick, Courtney Peterson, and the student volunteers, Ben Ngosa, Gabby Chia, and Shannon Foss, who are recording and uploading tonight's lecture to the school's website, and also to my colleague Shane Gunster, my fellow co-conspirator, as it were, in organizing this year's lecture, and he'll be chairing the Q&A session after the talk. Finally, many thanks to staff members Brenda Baldwin and Grace Huey, who helped so much to make arrangements and to get the word out about tonight's talk. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Bill Carroll himself. I was fortunate to get to know Bill and his family as a result of our collaboration on a research project in the early 2000s, which yielded a book called Remaking Media, The Struggle to Democratize Public Communication. I've come to appreciate Bill as a valued colleague and friend, an enthusiastic guitarist and music video composer, and a pretty decent hiker as well on the occasions that we met in the Southern California desert, where, as it turned out, we also stepped in the footprints of a former previous Smythe lecturer, Vinnie Moscow, when I actually encountered him totally by chance in the middle of a 1,000 square mile desert park. One of those lightning bolt moments. But Dr. Carroll has acquired international renown for his research in the areas of the political economy of corporate capitalism, social movements and social change, and critical social theory and method. He's been a member of the Sociology Department at the University of Victoria since 1981 and founding director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Social Justice Studies. The books that he's managed to do without me include, there's a lengthy list, and it's on the blurb that went out with the publicity, but just to mention the titles, they include Expose, Oppose, Propose, Alternative Policy Groups, and the Struggle for Global Justice, A World to Win, co-authored with Kanchan Sarker, The Making of a Transnational Capitalist Class, Corporate Power in a Globalizing World, Corporate Power and Canadian Capitalism, Critical Strategies for Social Research, and Organizing Dissent. Bill currently co-directs Mapping the Power of the Carbon-Extractive Corporate Research Sector, Resource Sector, which is a project, or really a research program, also known as the Corporate Mapping Project. It's an interdisciplinary partnership of several universities and civil society organizations, particularly the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The project traces various modes of corporate power and resistance within the global political economy, focusing on fossil capital here in Western Canada. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Carroll. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Bob, and thanks for the invitation to give this lecture. Let me begin with an obvious starting point, if I could get my computer to work here. Here we go. The symptoms of climate crisis are abundant. And in general terms, I think we can agree with Naomi Klein that the culprit is capitalism. But blaming capitalism in the abstract does not really get us far and could lead us up some blind alleys, such as the paralysis of catastrophism, right? You know, like what can we do? It's just, the problem is so wicked and big, it's beyond our control. One important question to ask, I think, is who within capitalism bears responsibility? And I'm going to get to that. But in the first part of this lecture, I want to home in on two signal aspects of contemporary capitalism and explore their intersections, because I think this is important in situating the nature of the problem. And these are fossil capital and communicative capitalism. Now, fossil capital has been with us from the inception of industrial capitalism. The development of capitalism as a globally dominant way of life rested on carbon energy, which empowers capital to accumulate on an extended scale, but releases CO2 on the same scale, leading inevitably to climate crisis. Fossil capital has been deeply implicated in the political and cultural forms of advanced capitalism. Tim Mitchell in Carbon Democracy notes, ironically, that from the 1870s on, the age of democracy coincided with the age of empire. He says, the rise of coal produced democracy at some sites and colonial domination at others. At the core of the world system, coal mining brought workers together at a key point in the commodity chain, enhancing their power and enabling the northern working class to demand concessions that led to carbon democracy and suburbanized consumerism. Now, even if the American dream is a hoax for many people, it continues to enchant. And it poses a great barrier psychoculturally to movements for climate justice. The dream is not uniquely American. In its 2014 branding campaign to build support for Northern Gateway, Enbridge reminded us that life takes energy. Who can resist chocolate cupcakes with raspberries? Now, capitalism has always relied on and stimulated communication. And of course, as mentioned, Dallas Smythe, this lecture is in honor of, is a key theorist in this regard. From Adam Smith to Hayek, capital's champions have celebrated markets as capital's nervous system, a network of signaling mechanisms for coordinating production and consumption without any collective plan. State formation often involved consolidation of national languages, and on that basis, the development of mass media as a profit-driven industry, conjoined with the rise of advertising and promotional culture. Corporate control of mass communication led to the situation that Dallas Smythe theorized in fact, as early as 1951, the production of audiences as commodity. And in 1951, he pondered what mass media produces and observed, quote, there is that product known as station time, and sometimes as audience loyalty, which stations sell to advertisers. Of course, the increasing scale and scope of the culture industries figured significantly in what Habermas called the decline of the public sphere and the colonization of the life world, leading to a widening democratic deficit. By the mid-1980s, Neil Postman wondered whether, as television culture reduces public discussion to entertainment, we might be amusing ourselves to death. Now, emerging in recent decades and gaining pace with the introduction of Web 2.0 in 2005, communicative capitalism takes these as its premises, but makes a qualitative leap enabled by networked information technology. In their quest for profit, the social media newspapers, social media majors, have facilitated online pseudo-communities that function as niche markets for them, accentuating the public sphere's fragmentation into disjointed feed bubbles and echo chambers. With these developments, we can see the various indications of how extensive communicative capitalism is, just in terms of usage and sales. But with these developments, Smythe's original analysis gains force. Users who upload photos and images, write wall postings and comments, accumulate friends, constitute an audience commodity that is sold to advertisers, according to Christian Fuchs. Decentralized as many-to-many communication, corporate social media transforms the audience commodity into an internet prosumer commodity whose paid and unpaid and constantly surveilled labor fuels accumulation. Indeed, the global digital assembly line has arrived as corporations outsource tasks online and dismantle wages into micropayments to users and customers. Now, Jodi Dean is a theorist of this phenomenon, and she argues that, quote, just as industrial capitalism relied on the exploitation of labor, so does communicative capitalism rely on the exploitation of communication. For Dean, communicative capitalism names the formation through which contemporary communications media capture their users in intensive and extensive networks of enjoyment, production, and surveillance. In concordance with Smythe, Dean sees communicative capitalism as simultaneously economic and ideological, objectifying and subjectifying, and imbued with substantial class power. Although touted as a liberatory democratizing force, communicative capitalism generates sharp inequities. A few supernodes dominate the social network, relegating nearly all users to the long tail of this distribution, in other words, a permanent marginality. These inequities are exacerbated by the concentration of communicative capital. Now, I want to take up a generous conception of communicative capitalism here, extending beyond capital's stepped-up colonization of the life world to include the integral role that digital communication now plays in capitalism's circuitry in the world of business. The dynamic networks and algorithms of digital communication are at the center of financialization, after all, a hallmark of our neoliberal era. A digitized international financial system supplies fossil capital with its monetary lifeblood. But by the same token, fully embedded within that system and within the financialization of everyday life is communicative capital. Meanwhile, corporate capital's preferred fix for the climate crisis, financializing carbon emissions into a tradable commodity, requires the communication technology that enables financial capital to move at the speed of light. In this sense, carbon trading is a form of communicative capitalism. It depoliticizes global warming into decontextualized arrays of technocratically guided choices by investors and consumers, making it, as Larry Lohman has said, more difficult even to see what the central issues of climate justice are, much less to take action on them. But the power of fossil and communicative capital is even more deeply rooted at the visceral level of everyday life. Both fossil capital and communicative capitalism have developed persuasive means of hegemonic incorporation, which operate economically and ideologically. In consumer capitalism's golden years, as Matthew Huber notes in his book Lifeblood, cars, single detached houses, and appliances energized segments of the working class. Now, within this assemblage, the individual experiences automobility as empowering and liberating, and the single detached house as a domain of personal sovereignty. The long-range result, as Huber suggests, has been to constrain politics within narrow limits focused on the family, private property, and anti-collectivist sentiments, which happen to be the stock and trade of neoliberalism. Loyalty is similarly secured on a quotidian scale within the affective networks of communicative capitalism. Jody Dean suggests that these networks generate and amplify enjoyment. They also require constant and pervasive communication, which in itself can be a regime of control in which people willingly and happily report on their views and activities and stalk their friends, as Jody Dean puts it. Now, as key fractions, one foundational to industrial capitalism, the other emergent in our time, fossil and communicative capital are at the center of both accumulation and legitimation in our world. I want to focus on the use of communicative capitalism by Canada's fossil fuel industry in protecting and advancing its interests. Beyond immediate business needs, fossil capital and its allies use digital communication strategically to shore up popular support and slow the pace of decarbonization. Consider, for instance, the online initiative that industry has mounted in the past few years through its trade association, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP. CAP owns and operates Canada's Energy Citizens, a website that trumpets the goodness of fossil capital and invites each of us to become an energy citizen. Let's take a tour of the site using screenshots from a few weeks ago. But before we get to that, I'll point out that CAP's campaign is closely modeled on that of its sister organization, the American Petroleum Institute, which also has an Energy Citizens campaign that it runs. So what's going on here? Well, CAP's campaign, if we go to the Energy Citizens homepage, features two happy young women in an urban green space, looking into our eyes, offering high fives that fit nicely within the Canadian maple leaf. The text says, "We need a more balanced discussion about energy, the economy, and the environment," implying that the current discourse is biased, but insisting that together we can change the conversation. From the Energy Citizens, I don't know how that happened. From the Energy Citizens homepage, we can jump in four directions. Each vector persuades us that fossil capital is the solution, not the problem. Whatever direction we choose, the national interest is always aligned with, if not identical, with the interests of fossil capital. The headline atop each page reads, "There are many ways that the energy industry keeps Canada strong." Text underneath embellishes this purely ideological claim. When the energy industry thrives, Canada also thrives, and so on and so forth. Now, none of these statements mentions oil and gas. However, when the site takes up as a shared benefit energy in our daily lives, oil and gas become the lifeblood of the Canadian way. Our daily lives are fueled by oil and natural gas, we are told. Within this scenario, hockey pucks and family dinners appear as manna from petro heaven. What about the climate crisis? Across the website's 18 pages, climate concerns are mentioned 3 times, and in each case, the solution is purely technological. Here they are. Besides reassuring us that big carbon has our interests at hand, the Energy Citizens site is a vehicle for activating astroturf collectivism. The point of it all is for citizens to protect the national interest by speaking out. This 2005 recruitment ad is exemplary. It invites each of us to show our love for Canada's energy by standing up for our industry. Here we see how fossil capital makes strategic use of communicative capitalism as a mobilizing device. The examples can easily be multiplied. An interesting case is that of Bernard the Roughneck, who rose to national prominence in September 2016 when he presented a petition and delivered an impassioned plea in the House of Commons, wearing oil-stained coveralls and a hard hat. Behind the persona, Neil Bernard Hancock did work as an oil industry roughneck, but his performance in Ottawa was carefully prepared in collaboration with the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors and Rebel Media. CAODC organized the online petition drive through its Oil Respect campaign, which closely resembles CAP's Energy Citizens initiative, and also funded Hancock's travel to Ottawa. But in the months leading up to the performance, the Rebels' Bernard the Roughneck page featured an interview with said roughneck that went viral. Now, if Rebel Media made Bernard an online star, he soon returned the favor by filming himself at work on Rig 45, dispelling rumors of his being a paid actor. And I'm just going to show you this clip from Rig 45.
What, you thought this was a wig? This is Bernard, Canada's favorite roughneck, coming at you from Rig 45, telling you to tune in to the Rebel, not media, for all your heavy-hitting conservative news needs. And all you fellas back home sitting on the couch, hang in there, our friend Brendan Zoolander said. Hold on, keep strong. Oil patch is a family. We got each other's backs in this. It'll come back up. It always does.
Okay. So this video exemplifies the affectively charged promotional culture of communicative capitalism. We can see that it's authentic and yet scripted. It's an advertisement for fossil capital and the rebel media that tugs at the heartstrings of lifeblood, while mobilizing online communicative resources. And Bernard the Roughneck's celebrity continues to benefit big oil. A few days ago, Alberta-based Rally for Resources organized a demonstration in downtown Vancouver to counter a demonstration 20 to 40 times larger on Burnaby Mountain against Kinder Morgan expansion. Bernard made a cameo appearance at the smaller demonstration, gave a speech. CTV reporter furnished some free advertising on Twitter, as you can see, while mainstream media presented the false equivalents of rally and counter-rally, ignoring the vast differences in scale. When its Bernard the Roughneck interview first went viral, the rebel enthused, "Bernard the Roughneck proves the power of the internet is incredible." Incredible perhaps, but recalling Dean's analysis, we should ask which social forces wield and benefit from that power. Now, I want to use this example to move into a more concrete analysis of fossil capital, its allies and adversaries in Canada, and the role of communicative capitalism within these relations. In the fall of 2013, I started working with Shannon Dobb of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, BC, on a proposal for a community-university partnership that we call the Corporate Mapping Project, as Bob mentioned in introducing me. Funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in 2015, our partnership now comprises a team of more than 100 researchers and activists and a dozen partner organizations. The CMP is a 7-year-long program of critical knowledge production and mobilization, co-directed by Shannon and me. It is founded in a shared commitment to advancing reliable knowledge that supports citizen action and transparent public policy toward a just transition away from fossil capitalism. Our work focuses around 4 questions. First of all, how is corporate power organized in and around the fossil fuel sector? Second, how does that power reach into political and cultural life? How is corporate power wielded and resisted at ground level, from carbon extraction and transport right through to final consumption, including transport at Burnaby Mountain, of course? How can we build capacity for citizen monitoring of corporate power and influence while expanding the space for democratic discussion? So these 4 questions animate 4 research streams, which we've rolled out in a staggered way. These streams are complemented by extensive knowledge mobilization initiatives, including conferences, blogs, summer institutes, publications, of course, and our website on which you can find our publications freely available. Although we publish in scholarly journals, the Corporate Mapping Project is a venture in action research. Our community advisors bring to the table extensive knowledge from years of grassroots activism. Our initiatives are balanced between inquiry and knowledge mobilization, with the latter framed as public sociology in dialogue with publics in ways that help inform and empower. Our action research employs social media and more traditional forms of media in a number of ways, in exposing and problematizing the power of fossil capital and its allies to various publics, sometimes with infographics like this one, in shining a light on the practices and relations that reproduce this power on an expanding scale. And of course, some of those practices have to do with finance. Providing evidence-based ammunition to our allies in social justice, indigenous, and ecological movements, including a steady stream of blogs that are often picked up by other media. We also collaborate with progressive journalists in investigations and popularizations that have been published in The Guardian, The Toronto Star, and elsewhere. And we offer policy analysis that engages dominant frameworks while proposing feasible alternatives that point to climate justice and energy democracy. In this way, we are building a change-oriented community of practice, producing critical knowledge that informs political practice. Now, let me focus on a few of our 25-odd sub-projects that intersect with the themes of fossil capital and communicative capitalism. One of our priorities is to map out the networks through which carbon capital reaches into civil society. As we have seen, fossil capital uses social and mass media to build and maintain popular support, but elite networks also provide less visible channels of influence. In a study that will soon appear in the Canadian Review of Sociology, we map elite relations between the largest Canada-based fossil capital corporations and several knowledge-producing sectors of civil society. The latter include industry associations and business advocacy groups that define and advance corporate interests. They include business-sponsored think tanks that focus on producing evidence-based commentary and analysis from a standpoint sympathetic to business interests. And they include universities and university-based research institutes with mandates relating to carbon energy, which produce knowledge and knowledgeable people for corporate business and the wider society. And what we find is a pervasive pattern of carbon reach into these domains through interlocking directorates, forming a single connected elite network centered in Alberta, yet linked into central Canadian corporate elite through hegemonic organizations, including major financial institutions. The largest fossil fuel firms are particularly engaged, as are civil society organizations that produce and circulate various kinds of knowledge, from the strategic communications of CAP and the BC Business Council and other groups, through the policy analyses of the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute, to academic and scientific knowledge produced at the University of Calgary and other organizations of its kind. Our mapping helps explain the yawning chasm between scientific knowledge and political action. The many threads of communication and collaboration in civil society afforded by interlocking governance boards enable the carbon capital elite to define, defend, and advance its profit-driven concerns as common sense in the public interest. This architecture enables a soft denial regime that acknowledges climate change. Nobody argues, except maybe Donald Trump, but basically nobody argues that climate change isn't happening anymore. But it makes that acknowledgement while protecting the continued flow of profit to fossil fuel and related companies. What obstructs serious action are corporate interests expressed in part through the intricate elite network that reaches from carbon capital boardrooms into civil society. But the network also reaches into the state. And in this study, that has just appeared a few days ago in the Canadian Journal of Communication, Gwen Blue and Shannon Daub and their co-authors analyzed industry submissions to the climate leadership panels in Alberta and BC. Industry submissions emphasized the need for, quote, balanced approaches that stoke growth and international competition, international competitiveness, in other words, improving corporate profits, while aspiring to gently reduce emissions. Both governments incorporated these recommendations into their plans, ignoring supply-side options such as asset retirement, wind down, and removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Our research exposed the BC process as a textbook example of institutional corruption. In BC, the Climate Leadership Panel's 32 recommendations were essentially ignored by the Liberal government. Instead, the new policy was hatched in Big Oil's boardroom at CAP's Calgary office, as the BC government coordinated a secret 3-month-long, quote, consultation with industry to write the actual plan. So despite the appearance of public consultation, climate policy promotes a new denialism that normalizes the primacy of the market and the inevitability of carbon-based economic growth. Now, the elite networks that connect fossil capital into civil society and into such state projects as climate leadership are also on display in what Bob Neubauer has termed a discourse coalition, which uses social media and other platforms to convey its message to wider publics. In a dissertation Bob completed last summer, he examines how between 2011 and 2014, various actors coalesced into pro- and anti-Northern Gateway discourse coalitions. These coalitions can be conceptualized as the politically active segments of broader historical blocs and alliances. A hegemonic petrobloc, but also a potentially counter-hegemonic bloc organized around, quote, environmental, decolonial, and left-wing politics, end quote. Among the key civil society members of the petrobloc were the Fraser Institute and Ethical Oil. The latter, Ethical Oil, founded by far-right activist Ezra Levant, served as launchpad for the rebel media in 2015. In the campaign for Northern Gateway, Ethical Oil amplified Joe Oliver's claim that environmental groups opposing the project were, quote, foreign-funded radicals, end quote, enemies of the national interest, now a favorite trope of Alberta Conservative leader Jason Kenney. Now, another interesting project that's in progress, spearheaded by Shane Gunster, offers further insights on how fossil capital mobilizes within the networks of communicative capitalism. The study analyzes the Facebook feeds of 7 key nodes in promotional and advocacy social media infrastructure for the Canadian fossil fuel sector. These groups aim to transform passive supporters into engaged issue publics. Their online efforts strive to construct, quote, a coherent, accessible, appealing, and easily shared set of narratives and frames to legitimate and justify fossil fuel development. For instance, a Canadian public interest frame celebrates the economic benefits that allegedly flow to all Canadians from these extractive activities. Within the affective economy of communicative capitalism, these messages stir emotions that are motivating, whether they celebrate the blessings of carbon or convey the suffering of working-class families whose livelihoods depend on a threatened industry. Rich celebrities are cast as the enemy, along with hypocritical environmentalists who are traitors to the national interest. All the ingredients of communicative capitalism are on display here in a multifaceted effort to build popular support for the petrobloc. Now, at the Corporate Mapping Project, we are using the very same communicative resources in collaborating closely with fossil capital's critics in the struggle for a world beyond fossil capital. One of our key initiatives is an online interactive database now in development through which activists and journalists and social scientists, concerned citizens, can map corporate power in and around Canada's carbon-extractive sector. In this, we're working closely with our partner, the Public Accountability Initiative, which runs Little Sis, an involuntary Facebook of corporate and political elites in the United States. Through its network drawing app, Oligrapher, Little Sis makes it fairly easy to map the power. So here's an example of such a mapping from an early point in Hillary Clinton's run at the presidency. The map shows the bundling of more than $800,000 in donations from oil and gas companies through the efforts of lobbyists employed in that sector, and that $800,000 directed to Hillary Clinton's campaign. It shows that Donald Trump was not the only horse in the race, with close ties to fossil capital. Our online mapping tool will link into Little Sis's data, but will focus on Canada's carbon extractive sector, the emitters, as well as the organizations that serve as enablers and apologists for fossil capital in Canada. Now, as a complement to that tool, picking up on a favorite device in the business press, we're currently compiling the top 50. Mimicking the business press, we plan to release a new top 50 each year. Our top 50, however, differs from the fawning tributes in the Financial Post. We target Canada's top climate culprits. So our approach redeploys the hegemonic notion of a top 500 or 25 in a critical direction, calling attention to the principal agents in Canada's regime of obstruction. We include as emitters the main producers and distributors of fossil fuels, including pipeline companies. Given the intense concentration of capital in this sector, a handful of the largest firms account for most of the emissions. The top 10 leading producers account for 62% of everything that's pumped by Canada's 100 leading oil and gas firms. As for the key organizations that enable fossil capital to conduct business as usual, we're focusing on two types of enablers: financial institutions and institutional investors that are heavily committed to the industry. And secondly, at the lower part of this slide, captured regulators, state bodies that are often headed by industry insiders that green light new projects and tend to turn a blind eye to environmental concerns. Our own network data provide guidance in identifying the key players, as in this mapping of interlocks between the Royal Bank of Canada, which is most certainly an enabler, and 8 fossil fuel firms in Canada. And then we have the category legitimators, or apologists, if you will. This is a diverse category of civil society-based organizations, including industry groups, business councils, advisory advocacy groups, think tanks, research institutes, and universities. Such organizations persuade the general public and political elites that business as usual must continue, that any big shift away from carbon is unfeasible or unnecessary. We've been working up case study profiles of each of these top 50 organizations, which will live on our website, providing relevant information to activists, journalists, concerned citizens, and so on. The point is to combine social science with a rhetorical strategy that outs the fossil capital oligarchy, the organizations, and in a later phase of our work, individuals that maintain the current regime. In this, our work is also inspired by Richard Heedy, founder of the Climate Accountability Institute, who has identified the 90 corporations responsible for the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. It's a kind of calling attention to the main culprits, if you like, or emitters in the case of Richard Heedy's work. So let me just move to a few conclusions. For fossil capital's adversaries, the challenge is to go beyond a politics of resistance. And for the Corporate Mapping Project, this means beyond outing the carbon oligarchy, which is really a kind of politics of resistance. In the second half of our partnership, we will continue to map the power, but we will also explore solutions. This means outflanking the technological, technocratic, and market-based so-called solutions that leave corporate power intact, and proposing alternatives that counter the emerging hegemonic project. After all, fossil capital does not stand still. It shows signs of morphing into green capitalism. Shell's recent explanation for dumping tar sand assets last year is indicative. Shell sees a global shift from carbon to electricity sourced from non-fossil energy, rendering high-cost operations like the tar sands unprofitable. However, the transition needs to be managed so that existing assets are fully valorized or unloaded before they become stranded, as in the case of the tar sands. Green capitalism will, of course, retain a possibly scaled-back fossil fuel sector, while expanding renewables as a high-profit industry and opening up geoengineering, very likely, as an emergent branch that may give carbon-based capital energy a new lease on life. Intriguingly, the main backers of BC-based carbon engineering, one of 3 well-advanced geoengineering demonstration projects in the world, are Bill Gates, the godfather of communicative capitalism, and Murray Edwards, not nearly as famous, one of Canada's leading fossil capitalists. The consolidation of communicative capitalism and shifting accumulation strategies of fossil capital, and the continued pattern of corporate obstructionism, while green capitalism waits in the wings, all point to the urgency and the difficulty of creating an alternative. There's no doubt that change is here to stay, whether in our communication systems or in energy. The question is, what kind of change? In this unstable conjuncture, we need to find ways of championing energy democracy and climate justice. Energy democracy has been endorsed by the international trade union movement. It mandates a double power shift. You think of this as a double power shift, from fossil-fueled power to renewables, that is, decarbonization, and from corporate oligarchy to public democratic control of economic decisions, that is to say, democratization. This means shifting power over all aspects of the energy sector. It means creating a socially just energy system that works in the public interest. And it means a transition from high carbon to low carbon and ultimately 100% renewable energy. As for climate justice, the Global Justice Ecology Project offers a good definition that I've put on this slide. It combines community-led solutions driven by the well-being of indigenous and local communities and the ecosystem with transformation of our corporate-based neoliberal political economy and an end to corporate globalization. Now, if energy and communication are codependent, as I've suggested that they are, transforming one means transforming the other. Ultimately, the struggles for energy democracy and for communicative democracy are linked. They imply a wider struggle for participatory democratic forms across economic, cultural, and political fields. In Remaking Media, Bob Hackett and I argued a dozen years ago that democratic media activism comprises a multifaceted politics that can become a kind of nexus, meeting point for progressive movements, pulling the threads together. A dozen years on, and notwithstanding the continued hegemony of corporate media, bolstered in some ways by communicative capitalism, there are encouraging signs of what David Beers and Robin Smythe call an emergent ecosystem of alternative progressive journalism. A, quote, independent digital public interest journalism sector. This sector is now strategically key, not only in the struggle for communicative democracy, but in the related struggle for energy democracy. And with that, and with the drama of sirens outside, I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. Fantastic talk.
Thanks.
Very thought-provoking, covered a lot of ground there. I'm sure that we have some questions. So we have a mic set up there, and given that we're recording the talk, if I could ask those of you who have questions to make your way to the mic. Do you mind making your way to the mic just at the front? Because we're recording it, and that also allows everybody to hear it. Yeah. Those of you who have questions, if you want to just line up at the mic, that's probably the easiest way to get things going. And if I could ask you to, if you have a comment and a question, to just keep them relatively brief.
Well, this is a question, but also a statement. Thank you for your lecture. I thought it was very well done. It's a difficult subject to stay very neutral in. And my concerns are basically what you brought up toward the end of your lecture, which is the liberal government taking liberal control over everything and preventing, the way I'm going to put it, preventing a democratic situation that would actually work for the people and not just corporation. There is a big piece that you've left out of your lecture, which more has to do with the politics of our central bank and the crown and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not going to bring that up. But there was a very interesting group coming out of Ontario. I think it was called the Common People Union. And the suggestion is that if we get 51% of the population of Canada, I know that's a big number, but we can basically make our politicians work for us. 51%. And I am surprised that we aren't doing a Common People Union here in BC, because I have found that the way to deal with these politics, with the politicians, with with all of their control, it's to play their game better than them. And that's not to say that it's going to be easy, but at least if we have 51% of people here voting as a group, we have a lot of power. So that's all I want, and I wanted to know what you think of that.
Well, I think definitely that we need to address the vitality of our democracy, and I think it's the meaning of democracy in countries like Canada has been really weakened over the last several decades due to the policies that we've been talking about. Like neoliberalism basically the basic message is that the state needs to get out of the way and let business work its wonders.
Well,
but
I don't think we should be
once
naive.
You've done that, there's not much room for democracy. Like you might have markets doing this and that, and
it's all corporations.
Enormous increases in social inequality and ecological problems with deregulated capitalism, but you don't really have democracy. So I think we've been moving away from democracy, and it is a really serious problem.
Yes, it is.
We need electoral reform for sure, so that every vote actually counts, as opposed to our first past the post system now that really is quite dysfunctional in terms of, some people would say it's functional because it tends to give rise to stable governments, but in terms of a criterion of democracy, in terms of people actually having their votes count, it's not a good system. So I'm totally in agreement that there's a real need to make some major changes in the way what we call democracy actually works in this country.
Well,
I would take it further, like you mentioned, corporations. I think there's a need, I think part of energy democracy is really trying to get us to focus our attention on the need for economic democracy. Because the deepest challenge, I think, to Canadian democracy is corporate oligarchy. That's right. The concentration of economic power in this country is astounding. And that is fundamentally anti-democratic, because the economy drives so much. And if we have an economy that's essentially oligarchic in its organization, we don't really have a democratic society, in my view. Like it's a very narrow kind of formally defined democracy that really, in substance, denies democratic power to the people.
Well, I just wanted to say in closing that, basically, Mr. Trudeau works for the Crown, and the Crown is not us. So you just sort of have to deduct this, for this is part of what's missing, which is doing the economics in favor of the people, as opposed to making a profit for the Crown. So there's a tug here, and that's why I go back to the 51%, and I welcome anyone who has the drive and the courage to work on getting all of us together so that all of our votes matter and they make a big difference. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Okay, that was a fascinating and, of course, also disturbing survey of what's going on. I just have a technical question for you.
Okay.
The communicative capitalism theory of Jody Dean and Christian Fuchs is basically an attack on the internet as a means of communication, which they view as completely co-opted and controlled by capitalism. and yet it's obviously usable for other purposes. You're using it.
Yep.
So I wonder, is it the right choice of theoretical framework to begin with this theory, which really leaves no room for the activity that you engage in on the internet, and then sort of skip over its limitations, as you do in the later part of your talk, by presenting your own use of the internet as a political resource? So I wonder if you don't
That's
need
a great
different
question.
theory.
Yeah, yeah. It's a. I guess what I would say is that, like my reading of Christian Fuchs and Jody Dean, that kind of approach, that is very pessimistic about the internet, right? And Jody Dean is very pessimistic about democracy, as a term, right? She problematizes that as well. I don't necessarily agree with all of that, but I think their basic analysis that really, I think, encourages us to not be too starry-eyed about the internet, I think is absolutely correct. As I look at what we're doing and the resources that fossil capital and its allies have to what they're doing, it's no question that it's not a level playing field. It's not at all a level playing field. But one can still play. Bob and I said this in our book 12 years ago. We can still play on a sloped playing field, and we've got the numbers, if you like. I mean, the plutocracy has the power, very well organized power, and they are using communicative capitalism to their advantage in various ways. But I guess where I would differ from Jody Dean perhaps is in seeing a bit more space for, counterpower to develop in this situation. So I would register that as a difference.
For non-rogue states, perhaps Norway, Germany is in between stages. What lessons can we learn from societies that go from a rogue state to a non-rogue state? Is it the dynamics of the non-civil societies coming on board, the governments and the military?
Well, if we think about Norway, that's really a good example of a state that is definitely not a rogue state, and where, in a sense, progressive political forces were strong enough in Norway to push for quite a different regime in terms of how it developed its offshore fossil fuel resources, and particularly capturing the resource rents for social purposes. There's a lot of diversity if we look from one country to another, and that's often a good way to do this kind of work because we can point to better practices elsewhere. I mean, what we have in Canada is a very difficult situation. As we know, we have a kind of petrostate in Alberta that really creates a kind of deadlock in terms of the national conversation. It's very difficult to pose alternatives, even though we need to be doing that. This is why I come back to more visionary alternatives like energy democracy and climate justice that really invite us to think big rather than to simply say, well, we need to protect existing jobs, right? How are we going to protect existing jobs and sunset the tar sands? We can't do that. Therefore, we have to keep with the tar sands forever. Well, that's not really a logical argument, but it is the way that a lot of people are looking at this situation. So we need, I think, we need more vision, and we also need, feasible policy perspectives that can actually connect the dots between our troubled present and a possible future, right, that gets us off the treadmill of production and onto a more democratic and egalitarian way of life. But I don't think I've answered your question terribly well, but I guess it's just going to have to do for now. We'll move on to the next person.
Thank you. My name's Robin Newton. I sort of have a comment and an invitation. Last summer, the Tamarack Institute took place in Vancouver, and I went to one session that really dovetailed very nicely with your topic tonight. It was called Changing the Story. And it talked about the messages that our young people are flooded with from very young, a very young age around, for example, consumerism. But yes, the kind of lifestyle that our use of oil and other energy products have enabled. And if we don't jump in there with an alternative story, that is all they're going to be exposed to. So one of the things that it was a very, again, kind of a bad news story and a little depressing. But I work in the child care sector and got connected with, for example, a woman from Science World, and we talked about how we can promote that other story at a very early age. And so I'm connecting her with BC Aboriginal Child Care Society about creating displays and educational materials for young children that talk about some of those more stewardship principles and replace this dominant story with another story for these kids. And that's what I'm inviting everybody to do, is look for ways that we can give our children access to a story that is much more sustainable.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. It's so important. This is very much a struggle, the struggle for people's hearts and minds. It's waged narratively. It's about our identities and how we think about our lives and the history of the world and where we come from and our social solidarities and future. All of that is narrative. So we do need to change the story. And Indigenous perspectives are extremely important, I think, in that process of trying to change the story. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about mapping left and green responses. So we have a massive plethora of theories of what a climate-friendly public interest would be circulating, but very little reflection on them. So groups like Clean Energy Canada, the Green Party, the NDP, the LEAP, we have a massive amount of proposals, but we don't have a good sense of who's behind them, what kind of social power they have, and the real differences in their commitments. And that ties in with a anti-capitalism which isn't super clear on varieties of capitalism and social democratic and putatively socialist forms, which in fact end up being very different types of capitalism. So what we end up with is a very blurry picture on the left of what's trying to be achieved. So I'm wondering if the mapping project is only corporations, or if it's also a diversity of theories of the public interest and how they're being wielded through different think tanks, which extends not just on the brown right, but through to the green left.
I missed the very last part of what you were saying about the think tanks.
Oh, well, it's less powerful on the left, right? There aren't as many people, but there are systems of creating think tanks and centers through the universities. There are newspapers which try and promote these visions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this last slide I showed was a gesture toward some of those organizations that are more journalistic, online journalistic organizations that are definitely worth checking out in terms of trying to change the story and provide more critical coverage of fossil capital and its allies and so on and so forth. And you're right, there are definitely think tanks, and we're a key partner in this corporate mapping project is the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is a very important progressive think tank, right, that has a pretty big presence in BC. In Alberta, the Parkland Institute is another one of our partners. And so we're definitely interested in building what we might call counterpower. So it's important you know, I began the talk with a bit of a caution about catastrophism, because that's not a good place to go in this situation, you know, where it's, you know, these are pretty dark days, in fact, I would say. But I think we need to really look at the possibilities in the situation that we're in. And there are various political organizations, you mentioned some of them, how all of this fits together into a counter-hegemonic formation. It's a bit early to say, in the sense that I think I think we're taking baby steps at this point, and we need to move pretty quickly. So I see the situation in fairly urgent terms, but I'm not at all hopeless.
But I mean, the CCPA are degrowthers, right? There's massive ideological differences on the left, and you can't even start talking about a counter-hegemonic formation and weaving together those until you've actually articulated those positions and who has them.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're getting, I mean, like Naomi Klein's his book is a great example of this kind of massive blur of everything from centrist Keynesians all the way to, you know, very deep anti-technologists. It's very hard to see what's going on the left in terms of responses, because no one's talking about it and no one's articulating it.
Yeah, well, books are written for different readerships. I would say Naomi Klein writes for very broad readership. She writes very effectively in engaging with diverse readers, which is very important. So part of it is a question of where are we in the political process that is an ongoing conversation. And you seem to be very frustrated that it hasn't come together yet. I can understand that completely. I think we have to keep the conversation going, and as you say, it's a very good idea to articulate the differences politically, to really get them out there so we can have some clarity of thought in terms of degrowth as one alternative project that is different from another alternative project that might not be degrowth, but might be some sort of, you know, eco-socialist project that isn't necessarily committed to degrowth per se. We can look at different projects and begin discussing them. I completely agree with what you're suggesting in that respect. That wasn't what this talk was about, of course, but you're right, that's an important priority.
Hello. First, thanks for the work that you do, and thanks for bringing it to us. We love it. Now, I've got the easy question. Are the slides or videos of this talk available on your websites?
I think they're going to be available on the SFU website.
Certainly recording of the talk is. I'm not sure for the slides.
I think we're going to try to incorporate the slides into the video. So
Okay. Thank you. And next, the information you've given me fuels my fight against the people who need opposing. You've renewed my energy.
Good.
And one of the arguments that I've been hearing from everybody that frustrates me is that everybody knows that renewables aren't ready yet and won't be in the foreseeable future. So I want to know if that's true, and perhaps also who is that everybody? It doesn't include me. And 3, what is it they claim to know? If you can give me an insight. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on these issues, but my understanding is that the situation is changing very quickly, and renewable energy is coming on at a much faster rate than was predicted. One of the major game changers is the question of storage and batteries. The technology on that has been advancing much more quickly than anybody expected, and the cost is decreasing and so on and so forth. So people are definitely talking about renewables, not just talking about, but actually implementing plans to switch to more wind power and solar power with energy backup in various locales, even in North America.
Thank you very much for your talk and all of your research. It's fascinating. One of the sorry, my name's Sapor Berman, and one of the things that's been really bothering me is that it seems like the more and more we see the expose of some of this research, the example you gave on the climate leadership team and the final recommendations being cooked up in Calgary, or even more recently, the work that the National Observer did when they interviewed Prime Minister Trudeau about the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And he said explicitly that the decision on the Kinder Morgan pipeline was a deal cooked up in Alberta well before his ministerial panel, which both of those things I would have expected to be quite a scandal, and to have ramifications for what happens next in the world. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we're somehow immune to it, that the integration has become, of the deep state, as Kevin Taft would say, has become so real to us and inevitable in some way that we become immune. That the Prime Minister saying, no, I didn't take that consultation with First Nations seriously, or that whole ministerial panel I created, no, we didn't listen to it. We cooked this deal up before, and it still goes on. And I'm curious about your ideas around where we take it past expose. Like, what are the ramifications? How do we take it to specific calls? There's some work now in the US around the separate oil and state work where there are a number of groups now working for pledges where they're asking politicians to pledge. Will you no longer take oil money? Mm-hmm. And that seems to be having serious ramifications and gaining speed. There's now, I don't know the numbers, but there's some numbers of congressmen, senators, et cetera, who are now pledging. Mm-hmm. And the more I look at your research and talk to Shannon and others, I'm just wondering what your thinking is on, what are the asks? What are the changes that we should be to make it sticky, to make it tangible in the world? And I just, sorry, while I have the microphone, I wouldn't be a good campaigner if I just didn't also add, you have all mentioned the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan pipeline and support for Indigenous peoples. And we're gathered on the mountain right now and every day at 10 o'clock, and we're blockading. And if people want to get involved, the website is protecttheinlet.ca. We could use more people just standing up there on the side of the road, supporting those who are taking a stand. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks very much, Sephora. And I wish I could answer your question in some depth and detail in terms of what is to be done. What are the pathways? What are the openings before us? I have difficulty seeing them too, and I think it is the two examples you provided are very dispiriting when you think about, the level of institutional corruption, really, and the way that it doesn't really register in a kind of sense of, there's something wrong here, there's something wrong with this picture. I think part of it is the way that some of these stories are covered in the mainstream media. There's less of a kind of sense of moral outrage than might be conveyed given the gravity of some of these scandals. But in terms of what we can do, I tend to look at this in terms of not so much the immediate tactical interventions, but I know if you're on the ground, let's say you're trying to block the Kinder Morgan extension, right? That's what you have to focus on. You need to have some sense of a broader strategy, but fundamentally that pipeline has to be blocked. And physical, civil disobedience is clearly a strategy in the repertoire that needs to be brought to bear, right? So I think the actual interventions vary from one situation to another, but in these kinds of situations where really, if you like, the rubber hits the road, basically there's a need for people to put their bodies on the line, and I salute those efforts, certainly. And I wish people the best who are able to participate in that effort, because it's very important. Now, if the Kinder Morgan pipeline is blocked, if it is not extended, that will be a major victory. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, what next? Obviously blocking one pipeline does not solve this problem. I mean, I was trying to lay out the big picture analysis of the problem. Right? It's a giant problem. It's the political economy of contemporary capitalism that we're talking about here. So, the solutions are not easily formulated. But I think in my view, we need to have both a sense of the immediate tactical situation, how we can intervene tactically, but also this more strategic analysis, which is, I guess, what I was providing in this talk. But I wish I could connect the dots between the two at this point, because that's really what we need, and we need to be working toward. Okay, more questions?
Hi, my name is Erwin Ostindi, and just wanted to thank you for coming onto our radio show last week, Democracy
Erwin,
North,
yes,
and talking about these issues.
good to meet you.
We're sitting here in the Engaged University, and the Tsleil-Waututh weren't consulted back in '52 when the Kinder Morgan pipeline was dumped into their community, but nor was Simon Fraser University when the same Crown gave the permission to the pipeline, gave the permission for the university to do land development on unceded land. So, in that spirit, I think it's important for all of us to, as Sephora said, check out protecttheinlet.ca and show up. It's good the faculty supported the fight against Kinder Morgan because it shows a consciousness and a criticality, place-based strategy when we do our research work, that we have an understanding of place-based work. But I think also, Oil Change International in the States and the mapping project are both really important toolkits that people can use. But I'm wondering, you talked about in your talk tonight about Indigenous well-being, but I'm wondering about going further. And I think when we look at the unregulated nature that you described, we really have to look at colonialism in Canada. And the colonial project of Canada goes hand in hand. And I think the alternatives, whether it's Melina Labucon's research on solar energy for Indigenous communities and how can Indigenous communities do economic development through alternative energy, I think that I would love to see more of that in the corporate mapping project. I think that we need to see the paradigm shouldn't just be the independent alternative media, but it also should be the independent self-determined economic strategies for Indigenous peoples as an oppositional position to this project you described so well.
Yeah. Well, that's a great comment and a fair criticism in terms of my not really featuring Indigenous struggle in this talk, but I absolutely agree with what you've said, Erwin. I think Indigenous struggle is important, on different levels, obviously ethically and politically, as a struggle of people who have been dispossessed, colonized, racialized, marginalized, basically a program of genocide, really cultural genocide, certainly in terms of residential schools. This is a really important political movement in this country and in other countries of the world. And if we think about Indigenous communities and some of the ideas circulating not just in Canada but in other Indigenous communities in the world, we can sort of, often I think settlers and colonists think of Indigenous communities as sort of belonging to a different era, but really we're talking about contemporary, more collectivist, solidaristic ways of life that human beings have developed. They work, actually, and they're inspiration, I think, for everybody. So, both in terms of just the social justice issues around the need to undo colonialism in this country, but also what can be learned by activists who are not Indigenous in dialogue and conversation and solidarity with our Indigenous comrades. I think these are really important times that we're living in, times of Indigenous resurgence, and people who are not Indigenous really need to pay attention to that. In the Corporate Mapping Project, we have two co-investigators who have joined not that long ago, who are both happen to be Indigenous and are working on the kinds of topics that you were just mentioning, Erwin, in terms of alternatives to fossil capitalism, coming out of Indigenous communities and Indigenous experiences, including alternative development programs using renewable energy. So I'll just leave it at that in terms of answering the question, but it's a really good comment.
Okay, I think a focus on decolonizing resistance is probably a good place to conclude.
Sure.
I would invite you all to join us. There will be a reception in the interestingly named Tech. Room. Yeah, where did they come up with that one? Just off to the left as you exit. We'd love to see you all there. And I'd like to thank again Bill Carroll for a great
Thank you. Thanks very much.